Hello and welcome to Stringham Real Estate Edge. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, also known as HUD seeks to increase home ownership, supports community development, and increases access to affordable housing. To help us better understand HUD's many programs, our guest today is Erik Amundson, Deputy Regional Director of HUD Region 8. Erik, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here. And Gary, I wish I could be there in person with you. I'm joining you from Denver, Colorado, the home of our Denver regional office. I would love to be there in studio with you, but I'm glad I can join through this platform.
Well, thank you. This works well, and we certainly appreciate the reservations that many people have about potential risk of the virus. Erik, tell us about HUD. How does it fit into the federal government? What's its purpose and function, and when was it created?
Yeah, great question. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, has a really neat history. Created in the 1960s, in 1965, as part of the Great Society under President Lyndon B. Johnson. And although it was created as a cabinet level agency at that time, it really dates back some of our work to the 30s. When you think about the Federal Housing Administration and how it was designed to really help with the Great Depression. Some of the work dates back to the 1930s as well, with developing public housing for low-income residents and low-income tenants. That all came together in the 1960s with the creation of HUD as a cabinet-level agency. And so now we're one of 15 cabinet-level agencies. And the goal, the mission of the department is to create inclusive, sustainable communities and affordable housing for all.
It sounds like HUD has a long history. I presume that HUD was originally a creation of Congress with a set of objectives to foster home ownership. How many different programs does HUD offer?
Well, HUD's programs are divided into what I would call four main pillars. Probably the most well-known is our housing division. And it's so big that we've divided it up into our Office of Single Family Housing and our Office of Multifamily Housing.
I see.
So in addition to that pillar, also our Office of Community Planning and Development, our Office of Public and Indian Housing, and also our Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, which really transcends all of our programs. So we have a variety of grant programs to communities, to different types of organizations throughout the region and throughout the country. And then also we have entitlement programs, which we provide annual funding to communities and competitive programs as well. And then on top of that, through our Office of Housing, and probably one of our most well-known programs is the Mortgage Insurance Program, which was originally part of the Federal Housing Administration. So really a range of programs and services that we provide throughout the country, which makes it such a fascinating agency because of the number of stakeholders that we work with.
How does the insurance program work?
Yeah, and great question, Gary. And this really gets back to kind of the foundation of the Federal Housing Administration. At the time, it was so difficult for people to get a home loan, to get insurance on a home loan. And so FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, was created to provide insurance so that lenders could make more loans on homes throughout the country. And so that's really kind of the core concept of FHA, is to provide insurance through lenders. So HUD doesn't make any loans directly, but we insure the loans through a variety of different lending institutions, whether it's credit unions, banks, or other lending institutions. And so we provide that needed mortgage insurance.
Give us an example of the entitlement program.
Yeah, so this is really an important part of the agency. And it's entitlement funding, which is provided on an annual basis to communities across the country. Part of HUD's mission is to focus on the larger communities. And so what we define as a larger community would be any community with a population of 50,000 people or more. They receive annual funding from the Department of Housing and Urban Development through what we call Community Development Block Grants, CDBG. And the neat thing about CDBG is that each one of these communities has such unique needs, so they can customize and design their own programs through the CDBG program. And that's what we consider entitlement funding to the largest cities. But we don't exclude the smaller communities either, because for those communities that are smaller in size, under 50,000 people, the state gets an allocation as well, an entitlement every year to distribute that money throughout the state. And so even though a community doesn't reach that 50,000 threshold, they still are entitled to get funding through the state, through their state agency as well. So we've found that historically, that's been just such a help to so many communities across the country to design specific programs for their communities that really meet the needs that are unique in different locations.
How many dollars are part of the entitlement program throughout the country,
Mhm. So
roughly?
HUD's annual budget right now is $60 billion. $60 billion for the entitled range of all HUD programs. And actually, in the upcoming year, the administration has requested an even larger budget increase, actually an additional $9 billion. And so again, that constitutes all of our programs across the entire spectrum of HUD. And what we've heard from communities, there's just such a need. There's such a need for more affordable housing. And the CDBG program is a big part of that. The CDBG program provides that vital funding, which is just so needed. It's, like I said, it varies in every community. And typically it's done on a formula basis. And so the largest component is population. And so the larger communities would receive more entitlement funding every year. It also, in this formula, we also look at things like poverty rates, homeownership rates, and a variety of variables as well to make sure that the money that we receive every year from Congress does truly go to those communities who need it the most. And so it varies by community throughout the entire country. But the main variable that I would say, Gary, is it's based on population.
I see. And is there one particular program in HUD that is wildly popular, that is more popular than any of the other many functions or services that you offer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's a good question, Gary. And I think it might depend on who you asked it to. And we have so many programs. Like I said, we have this range of programs, this array of stakeholders, that if I had to generalize, I would say some of the most popular programs would be based on the amount of funding allocated. And so out of all of our programs, the most competitive funding, the most of our grant funding goes into homelessness programs through our continuum of care. The continuum of care is a very unique program to federal government because it involves such a level of collaboration and stakeholder engagement. So all of the homeless service providers in every location meet regularly and they analyze their needs and they tell us what their greatest needs are and how they're going to meet those needs. And it's so neat because the program is designed to offer services through a continuum from people who are actually on the street, experiencing homelessness, to receiving treatment and services, to receiving supportive housing, to ultimately permanent housing. So there's this continuum of services, and all of our stakeholders get to work collaboratively on solutions. And so the largest component of all of our HUD competitive funding goes to what we call the continuum of care programs every year. And so in a sense, that makes it one of our more popular programs. But if you asked our community officials, our elected officials, our city managers, they might say that the CDBG program is one of the most popular because it meets an unmet need with the funding that comes in every year. We've heard such positive feedback from communities across the country that that's just such a necessary resource. You also might make the case that our fair housing programs might be among the most popular as well, because they serve everyone, not just people who are low income or meet a certain income threshold, but to uphold the fair housing laws. And so our investigators, our intake team, they work throughout the country on fair housing cases and investigations. And so in a sense, those could be considered the most popular as well. And so really, I think it varies based on the audience. And then to add one more variable to the mix as well, our largest component of the agency is actually the Office of Housing, our Federal Housing Administration. And so we have dedicated the most staffing to that office because of the work that we do with lenders and realtors, the work that we do with the lending community, with people trying to purchase a home. And so it just, like I said, it depends. It's so variable. And
Sure, I
that's the
understand.
great part about working for the agency, is to be able to touch so many different parts of communities and so many different organizations.
Eric, let me ask you about the CBG block grant
Mhm.
program. And those funds that are allocated to cities, to what extent do the cities have discretion or control over how those funds are spent? Or is that a prearranged agreement?
Right. So with our community development block grant funds, we intentionally try to make them very flexible to meet the unique needs in every community. But there are some requirements that each community has to meet. Number one is that the CDBG funding has to help low and moderate income families. They
Okay,
have to be the ultimate beneficiaries of that
sure.
funding. Um, Beyond that, it could be an imminent threat or some type of need of the community. And so there are a few basic requirements that have to be met. But that's the design, is to really help the low and moderate income families and
Okay.
individuals in every community.
Can
And then beyond that, we also require a public input component as well, because we really want to make sure that the general public has an opportunity to comment as well and to have a voice in the process.
mhm.
And so all of our entitlement communities, all of the communities that receive this funding, are required to do extensive public outreach and to gather feedback from community partners to come up with community plans. We call these consolidated plans on how they're going to use that funding to the maximum extent, to be efficient in how they use the funding and to draw in other partners as well. So in addition to meeting that need for low and moderate income types of uses, it's also unique in that we do require so much public involvement as well. And we found that to be so helpful, to give the community a voice in how those funds are being
Sure.
spent.
Eric, can you give us an example of how the subsidized rental housing program works? Just
Mhm.
give us perhaps an example of one household, one family, how they would go about securing this assistance.
Mhm. Yeah, a great question. And I think if you asked our frontline staff who answer the phones every day, that's one of the most common questions that we receive when people contact a HUD office. It's sometimes it can be overwhelming because there's so many different types of housing providers and services and resources out there. HUD provides funding to public housing authorities, PHAs. PHAs administer funding in their communities for rental assistance. And so there are income requirements that people have to meet. We want to make sure that our HUD funding is truly helping those who need it the most. And
Certainly.
so we make sure, the PHAs make sure they do screening to ensure that the money is helping the low and moderate income families. So a person would contact a PHA, and we have a listing of all of these on our HUD website. So we have PHAs scattered throughout the country, and PHAs know their communities the best. They know the housing resources, they know the developers, they know the owners. And so they're really truly positioned to help people the most. So a person would contact a PHA and they would fill out an application with their local housing authority, with their local PHA. Um, After they fill out an application, there's generally a waiting list. Unfortunately, there's such a demand and there's a limited supply. So there is typically a waiting list in most communities, especially in our larger communities. But at the time that a person's name does rise to the top of the waiting list, they will be issued a voucher. Some of your viewers might recognize the Section 8 housing vouchers. We typically just refer to them as housing vouchers, housing choice
Hmm.
vouchers right now, because they truly do give tenants choice in where they want to live. And so once a person does receive a voucher, they would seek a unit on the private market,
Sure.
and the voucher would pay for a portion of their rent. So the tenant would pay 30% of their income towards rent, and HUD would pay the remaining 70%.
Okay, so the rent would be subsidized at roughly 70% level. Now, is that a maximum, or would it scale down from there?
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, where we do have variation is by community, because as we all know, different communities have different types of housing
Sure,
markets. And so we do
understand.
studies every year to analyze what we call the fair market rents, what we would
Okay,
deem the fair market rents based on an evaluation of all the housing stock. And then we would pay up to the maximum of a fair market rent in a
okay.
community. And then also based on the size of the household as well, whether it's one person or a larger family. So there is a scale in that sense, but it would be up to a certain fair market rent in each
Sure.
community.
Okay. Let's move from rental for a moment to home ownership. What programs does HUD offer that will assist or foster home ownership?
Yeah, and I just wanted to start by noting June is the month every year that we recognize as Homeownership Month. And so we're really making an emphasis in June to promote homeownership. And the first step that we always advise is for anyone who's seeking a home to contact a housing counseling agency. HUD provides funding to housing counseling agencies to help people navigate the process.
Are these local agencies or are they part
Correct.
of HUD? They're local agencies.
Yes, these are local agencies in the community who receive HUD funding to hire counselors to help people navigate the system, to learn more about the process of buying a home,
Sure.
and to provide classes. That's just such a key component, as all your viewers know, just the educational component. And so we
Sure.
really emphasize that is housing counseling is so important. And so we always recommend that as a first step is the housing counseling. People can
Erik,
educate themselves on the
are there
process.
programs that offer 100% financing?
We don't at HUD. No, we don't provide any
Okay.
financing at HUD. But what we do is we provide the insurance through lenders. And so
Sure.
that's why, again, we direct people towards the housing counseling agencies.
Okay. And are there special homeownership grant programs available?
Mhm. Yeah, one of the neat programs that we also have, in addition to our CDBG entitlement funding, is what we call our home funding. And that's money that goes directly to communities and states to design their own programs through the home block grant program. And we see so many different uses of that throughout the country, but that is specific money that's set aside every year to develop affordable housing.
Hmm. How many people would you estimate a year benefit from the various HUD programs?
Mhm. If we look just at our rental programs, the best number that I could come up with would be around 5 million between our
5
different
million.
public
That's
housing
incredible.
programs, correct, our multifamily properties and our voucher programs. And as I mentioned, there's a waiting list, Gary. And so there's a demand for even more assistance as well. And I think that's part of the budget request that's increasing our budget in the upcoming year. Such a demand, and I wish there were more resources available. And I think that budget request will be helpful in doing so. But if you combined all of our rental programs, it would be around 5 million people every year.
That's incredible. Those of us in real estate hear regularly, frequently, the term affordable housing. Can you give
Mhm.
us a definition, or can you kind of explain what does affordable housing mean?
Mhm. Yeah, a great question. And the way we define it at HUD is 30% of a person's income would be spent on housing, including related expenses like utilities.
Is that
Just
an
because
average
there's
or is
so
that
much
maximum?
variation in market. Maximum, correct.
Maximum. Okay.
30%. Correct, correct. Yeah, and again, just because there's such variation between markets, and so we use that as a rule of thumb.
You mentioned FHA earlier, and the insurance aspect of the program is to insure the lender against potential loss under FHA programs. Now, you also indicated that FHA is not a direct lender, so that would suggest then there are lenders in the market. Can you give us an idea who they are? Are they banks, credit unions, mortgage
Mhm,
bankers, etc.? And they're
mhm.
they're approved
Sure.
by FHA. Is that the
Correct.
process?
Correct, Gary. Yes. And we have a listing on our website, and I would encourage all of your viewers to check that out. It's just simply HUD.gov. The question we get a lot from the general public is if we can recommend or if we can endorse one over another, and we can't. But we do provide
Of
a
course.
listing, and I would encourage everyone to check that out at HUD.gov. It is very extensive, but it's broken down by community and by state, so people can easily search for lenders in their community.
Hmm. How does one determine which mortgage meets their specific needs? Is that part of the counseling program that you mentioned earlier?
Mhm. Exactly. That's why housing counseling is so important. There's so many options for people, and our housing counselors are just such a wealth of knowledge when it comes to the variation between different types of loan products. And so that's why we encourage everyone so strongly to go to a housing counseling agency and to educate themselves, to learn more about these different products and to see which one fits their needs.
Mm-hmm. Are there fees or costs associated with any of the HUD programs that the borrower
No.
would have to pay?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Now with the programs that I was describing, when the lender does make a loan ultimately to a buyer, there will be the insurance and the premium. But as far as our programs, we wouldn't have any on that side.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's another program that is administered to veterans or active duty personnel, the VA loan program. And again, is that offered through individual primary lenders?
Yeah, I can't really comment on that one because that's outside of our agency. So to be totally honest, I wouldn't be the one to talk about that, but
Perfectly all right.
I would encourage you to.
Sure, I understand. Well, we just have a couple of more minutes for another question or two. Do either of the programs that we've talked about earlier, or any of the programs that we talked about earlier, have different lending standards? Are they all pretty much that using that 30% of gross income? Is that sort of a standard across the board?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mentioned our different fair market rents for the rental side and how it's almost like a tiered structure. And then for the income qualifications as well, it will be based on household size. So there are some variables that we look at. So that's why it's so difficult to explain the program uniformly, because there are these separate variables that are so specific to each scenario. But when it does come to purchasing a home, that's why, again, circling back to the housing counseling aspect is just so important. We consider it really crucial.
Now, as I understand it, these programs are available across the board, not only to couples, married families, households, et cetera, but also single individuals as well, correct?
Correct. Yes, that is correct.
And I presume when we talk about income, we're talking about the gross income of the household versus one individual within the household.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
Is that correct? Okay. If one is interested in learning more about the many HUD programs, what would you suggest they do? How can they learn more about these opportunities?
Well, two suggestions. Number one is to check out HUD.gov, our main website. It has a comprehensive overview of all of our programs. And so you can literally spend hours and hours and hours going through all of the different programs and resources available through the department. And we also list our key partners and stakeholders as well. Alternatively, just contacting your local HUD office as well. If someone would like a personal touch and to talk to a live person, we always have staff ready and available to answer their phones and to talk to people about their individual situations and to try to connect people with resources that might be the most helpful for them. But I would encourage people first to check out HUD.gov and then to also contact their local HUD office as well. And a listing of those offices is available online at HUD.gov.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's excellent, Erik. Thank you so much for your time being with us. And that concludes today's program. Thank you to our guest, Erik Amundson, Deputy Regional Director of HUD Region 8. Erik, again, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Gary. It's my honor.
That concludes this episode of Stringham Real Estate Edge. Today's program is brought to you by Stringham Schools, educating real estate professionals since 1989. Visit stringhamschools.com to learn more. We want to thank today's guests, and don't forget to tell us what you think in the comments section below. I'm Gary Barnes, and I'll see you on the next episode of Stringham Real Estate Edge.